Are you curious what really happened to Bob Dylan's 6 children? One became a celebrated frontman who forged his own path. Another built a life behind the camera, and others chose a privacy so complete that it became its own kind of statement. This is not a tabloid roll call, but a family atlas charting the ways a towering cultural figure's legacy splinters into music, film art, and the ordinary courage of living away from the spotlight. In the mid-1960s, as Bob Dylan was reshaping popular music with electric nerve and lyrical fire, he was also building a home life with a determination to keep it off stage. The albums came in waves, and the tours redrew the borders of fame. Yet inside that storm, he became a father first by marriage and adoption, then by birth. The public saw the myth. The children knew the man, the quiet intervals, the notebooks, the work ethic that made artistry look inexhaustible. What follows are the untold contours of Dylan's 6 children: Maria, Jessie, Anna, Samuel, Jacob, and Desiree. Some names you know well, some you hardly hear at all. Together they form a living counterpoint to the noise around their father, proof that legacy is not inheritance alone, but interpretation, choice, and distance. Let's begin with number 6 and trace our way to number 1, discovering where they are now, what they have become, and how the Dylan spirit echoes in expected and unexpected ways. Number 6. Maria. Dylan was born in 1961, a few years before the world began to call her father the voice of a generation. She was adopted by Bob Dylan shortly after his marriage to Sarah Lowndes in 1965, becoming the eldest of his 6 children. At that moment, Dylan's fame was cresting. He was electrifying audiences, rewriting folk music, and facing a kind of public worship that threatened to devour privacy. Yet, within the walls of their Woodstock home, Maria's presence offered something unshakably normal. While the outside world raged about protest songs and poetic revolutions inside the Dylan household, there was warmth, books, and music that didn't always belong to the stage. Maria's childhood unfolded during the most intense decade of her father's career, yet she was largely sheltered from the glare. Dylan, who despised the invasiveness of celebrity, guarded his children fiercely. When he retreated from touring after his 1966 motorcycle accident, he found solace in family life. For Maria, those years meant a father who was home writing quietly, tending to the garden, and playing acoustic guitar, not for crowds, but for his kids. As an adult, Maria continued to choose a life outside the public gaze. She worked for a time in film production and later in philanthropy, preferring her anonymity to the pull of her father's legend. She married musician Peter Himmelman, and together they raised children of their own, continuing Dylan's artistic line, but on their own terms. Unlike her younger siblings, Maria has rarely given interviews or spoken publicly about her father. She has become a figure of discretion in a family built on expression, a silent testament to the choice of privacy in a world that demands confession. Today, Maria lives quietly in California, balancing family faith and creativity, far from the mythic shadow that follows her surname. In her silence, there's something that echoes Dylan himself, a refusal to be pinned down, an insistence that life is best lived in between the headlines. Number 5. Jesse Dylan was born in 1966, the same year his father released Blonde on Blonde, a record that changed the vocabulary of rock music. While Bob Dylan was dismantling artistic boundaries, Jesse grew up in a household that prized independence, curiosity, and creative risk. He was a child, surrounded by books, guitars, and the low hum of typewriters in the night. Yet his own fascination wasn't with melody, it was with imagery. From an early age, Jesse was drawn not to the stage, but to the lens. In the 1980s, while his father was entering his gospel and later revivalist phases, Jesse was studying film and developing a precise visual sense. He discovered that storytelling could happen in light and motion as powerfully as it could in verse and rhyme. By the time he entered his 30s, Jesse Dylan had become a filmmaker and director, known for blending technical precision with emotional truth. His work soon found a global audience. He directed music videos for artists like Tom Waits and Elvis Costello, and later transitioned into feature films. The 2004 comedy Kicking and Screaming may have carried a lighter tone, but Jesse's deeper impact came through his visual campaigns for social causes. In 2008, his short film Yes We Can, a montage built around Barack Obama's campaign speech, went viral using artistry to move hearts and minds. It revealed that Jesse, though not a musician, had inherited his father's instinct for shaping culture. Beyond film, he founded LIBA, a nonprofit organization that combines storytelling and technology to improve healthcare collaboration. It's an unusual path for the son of a rock poet. But it fits perfectly within the Dylan philosophy: question the system, challenge convention, and make meaning out of chaos. Now in his late 50s, Jesse remains one of the quieter architects of modern visual culture. His work carries that same restless creativity that once powered his father's songwriting. Only the medium has changed from a guitar and a microphone to a camera and a cause. In his own way, Jesse Dylan has proven that the Dylan legacy isn't limited to song. It's an inheritance of purpose. Number 4. Anna Dylan was born in 1967 when her father was retreating from the chaos of fame to rediscover what it meant to live a quieter, more grounded life. By then, Bob Dylan had already reshaped the language of music. But what he wanted most was to be left alone, to be a husband, a father, and a man who could walk down the street without being followed. For Anna, this meant growing up inside one of the most fiercely guarded bubbles of privacy in modern music history. Anna's early years unfolded in Woodstock, New York, surrounded by woods music and solitude. Her father's friends, poets, painters, and fellow musicians passed through the house. Yet Bob and Sarah Dylan worked hard to create normalcy for their children. They went to local schools, played outdoors, and were largely insulated from the carnival of celebrity that awaited beyond the property lines. Dylan's withdrawal from the public eye during this period was as much for his children as for himself. As the years passed, Anna's siblings began to find creative outlets in film music and writing. But Anna herself chose a different path. She has maintained an almost total silence about her life, granting no interviews, publishing no memoirs, and avoiding even the smallest gestures toward fame. That quiet is remarkable in a family so synonymous with artistic expression. But it's also deeply revealing. Anna's anonymity is an act of authorship in itself, a way of defining her identity by what she withholds, not by what she shares. Those who have crossed paths with her describe her as introspective and kind, devoted to family and personal reflection. There are reports that she's pursued interests in visual art and spiritual study. But true to the Dylan pattern, she's never confirmed them. What's clear is that Anna represents the most private side of the Dylan lineage, the side that understands silence as strength. Today, while her name rarely appears in print, her influence is felt quietly within the family. A reminder that not all of Bob Dylan's children inherited the urge to perform. Some inherited his understanding that art begins where words end. Number 3. Samuel Dylan was born in 1968 at a time when his father had stepped off the relentless merry-go-round of fame and was living a quieter, family-centered life in Woodstock. The public still saw Bob Dylan as the prophetic troubadour of a restless generation. But inside his home, he was simply Dad, the man who fixed breakfast, played piano at odd hours, and read bedtime stories. For Samuel, childhood meant growing up in a world where art was constant, but never forced, where creativity hung in the air as naturally as conversation. Unlike some of his siblings, Samuel grew up with less direct exposure to the height of his father's fame. Dylan had turned away from constant touring and media appearances, determined to shield his children from the chaos that had consumed so many of his contemporaries. In that protected space, Samuel learned about independence and privacy values that would define him long after childhood. As an adult, Samuel Dylan chose a path that kept him firmly out of the spotlight. Little is publicly known about his career, but reports suggest he pursued work in business and visual media rather than performance. Friends and associates describe him as thoughtful and analytical, more interested in creation than attention. Though he hasn't sought fame, his grounding presence has been noted by those who know the Dylan family personally, someone who keeps the connection between siblings steady and unspoken. His life is a quiet contrast to the myth that surrounded his father. Yet that contrast reveals something essential about the Dylan bloodline. Where Bob turned the world's turbulence into art, she will turn that art into equilibrium. The ability to live privately, to build meaning without performance, may be the most radical legacy of all. Now, in his mid-50s, Samuel represents the understated continuation of his father's ideals: self-determination, curiosity, and the power of silence. In a family where every chord and lyric has been examined for decades, Samuel's story reminds us that the truest verse sometimes goes unsung. Number 2. Jakob Dylan was born in 1969, the youngest of Bob and Sarah Dylan's children, and the one who would eventually step most visibly into his father's artistic territory. While his siblings guarded their privacy, Jakob's destiny seemed inevitably drawn toward music. Yet his approach would be different. Where Bob Dylan had exploded onto the scene as a lone, unpredictable poet, Jakob would emerge decades later as the measured voice of a band that carried its own quiet force, the Wallflowers. Jakob's childhood unfolded during his father's most domestic years. He grew up between Woodstock and Malibu, surrounded by the residue of genius, but also by normal family rhythms, school bikes, and baseball. His father, still wary of fame's intrusion, kept the press away, but music was everywhere. Bob's records spun through the house, and guitars were never far from reach. Jakob absorbed the cadence of his father's storytelling, but developed an instinct to do it his own way, less sermon, more conversation. By the early 1990s, Jakob had formed the Wallflowers, a band that would soon cut through the decade's noise with literate, melancholic rock. Their 1996 album, Bringing Down the Horse, became a defining soundtrack of the era, driven by Jakob's restrained delivery and unshakable songwriting. Songs like One Headlight and 6th Avenue Heartache carried echoes of Bob Dylan's lyricism, but they spoke in a different emotional key, modern, cinematic, and grounded in personal observation rather than prophecy. The record went quadruple platinum and earned multiple Grammy Awards, proving that Jakob had carved his own place in music without borrowing his father's halo. Over the years, Jakob has remained fiercely protective of his individuality. He rarely discusses Bob in interviews, insisting that his lineage is obvious enough without explanation. His later albums, including Rebel Sweetheart and Exit Wounds, reveal an artist who continues to evolve quietly, preferring craft over spectacle. Offstage, he has advocated for environmental causes and produced documentary work such as Echo in the Canyon, exploring the 1960s California sound that influenced both his and his father's generation. Now, in his mid-50s, Jakob stands as proof that inheritance does not dictate identity. He carries the Dylan legacy not as a burden, but as a dialogue between generations, between art forms, between the weight of history and the freedom to keep creating. Through him, the music continues less a reflection of the past than a conversation with it. Number 1. Desiree Gabrielle. Dennis Dylan was born in 1986, long after the whirlwind years that had defined her father's legend. Her mother, Carolyn Dennis, was a gifted gospel and backing vocalist who had toured and recorded with Bob Dylan during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Their relationship remained deeply private, and so did Desiree's existence. So much so that the public didn't even know she was Bob Dylan's daughter until the late 1990s, when biographers finally uncovered the truth. It was not scandal, but secrecy. Dylan had simply chosen to protect this later chapter of his life from the endless intrusion of fame. By the time Desiree was born, her father was a veteran of reinvention, folk hero, rock poet, Christian convert, Nobel-level lyricist in waiting. Yet for her, he was just a parent who wanted normalcy. She spent her childhood far from the media spotlight, raised quietly in California by her mother, who continued to work in music and theater. Dylan visited when his touring schedule allowed, but his presence was discreet, built more on affection than appearances. As an adult, Desiree has continued that same preference for privacy. Little is publicly known about her professional life, though she has reportedly pursued both music and activism. She's never traded on the Dylan name, never sought interviews, and has maintained a remarkable distance from the machinery of celebrity. In that silence lies a kind of inheritance, the instinct to separate art from identity, to live without being consumed by the myth. Her mother, Carolyn Dennis, once said that Bob Dylan's decision to keep their marriage and child private was born out of love, not shame. He wanted Desiree to have a childhood untouched by scrutiny, a space to grow without comparison. And that decision, decades later, seems prophetic. While the world continues to analyze every lyric her father ever wrote, Desiree lives as a reminder that some stories are meant to remain unrecorded. Now in her 30s, she represents the final verse in the family's composition, a quiet coda to a life symphony that began with rebellion and ended in reflection. Desiree's life may not play out on stage or in the press, but it embodies a truth her father has always understood, that the most powerful songs are the ones you never have to sing aloud. From protest anthems to poetry that rewrote an era, Bob Dylan built a mythology that transcended generations. Yet behind the public enigma was a man who quietly raised 6 children, each one finding a different rhythm in the long echo of his name. Their stories form a mosaic of independence and inheritance. Maria, the calm matriarch who chose privacy. Jesse, the filmmaker, translating vision into movement. Anna, the invisible center who holds the family's silence. Samuel, the observer who turned solitude into steadiness. Jacob, the heir who reshaped melody for a new age. And Desiree, the final child proof that the Dylan spirit endures quietly in places unseen. Together they reveal the paradox of being a Dylan, to belong to a legend, but live apart from it. Their lives are not sequels to their father's songs, but parallel verses, each defined by choice rather than expectation. Some turned away from fame, others transformed it. Yet all carried the same unspoken inheritance, an understanding that creation begins in solitude and that the truest art resists definition. Bob Dylan himself once wrote, "A man is a success if he gets up in the morning and goes to bed at night, and in between does what he wants to do." By that measure, his children have succeeded in their own ways. They have lived quietly, purposefully, and on their own terms. In their restraint, there is rebellion. In their anonymity, there is freedom. The Dylan family's story is not about legacy. In the traditional sense, it is about endurance, transformation, and the courage to remain undefined. Through his 6 children, Bob Dylan's influence extends beyond music into something far subtler: the right to live truthfully, to make meaning without spectacle. And perhaps that is the greatest song of all, the one that never needed a guitar, just the steady rhythm of ordinary lives, carrying forward the extraordinary spirit of a man who once changed the world with words.